Well, welcome back, everybody. We're going to do a head count after every session where there's food to see who... I must apologize. I had a couple of complaints during the lunch break. The first of which was I apparently didn't give you the full password that you have to type in for the Wi-Fi. So it is Africa Unlocked 2026, all small caps. So Africa Unlocked 2026. I apparently forgot to say the 2026 part. Now, in my defense, one of the things I made very clear last year was that I am aging a little. I'm getting on in years. So the other complaint that I had was that last year I used that as my way of explaining why I had so many dad jokes. And someone said, well, you were so funny last year. What's happened? You were a little bit stiff this year. So I said, I'm a very serious person. We've got very serious topics to discuss this year, so there will be no dad jokes of any kind. I did have an interesting conversation with one of the clients who is in the medical field, and I found out something that's absolutely fascinating to me. Did you know that when it's time to go, your pupils are the last bits to shut down? The reason is because they dilate. Do you see why? I just wanted to be serious this year. All right, building legacies that last, wealth succession and international capital. With roughly 2 decades of global corporate finance experience, he's a key figure in the funding, scaling, and public listing of major high-growth African enterprises. He's going to be hosting our next panel and facilitating it. Please welcome to the stage Yusuf Nodbai, Head of Structured Capital. Yes.
Thanks everyone. I'd just like to call up the panel that's going to join me. Clayton, Stella, Michael. You know, the funny thing with all these photos, everyone's photo looks like it was taken straight after matric, except for mine. Someone got, Clayton, geez, you look like 19 there. But anyway, listen, I guess in opening, the one thing I wanted to do was just to pay tribute to entrepreneurs in the room. I think it's the hardest job in the world. There's a reason 2/3 of the world's billionaires are business people, because it's a really hard job to do. And I think it's a special and unique brand of person that wakes up every day and chooses to build a business. But it's the building of those businesses that truly unlock this great continent we call Africa. And there's a great quote which says, an entrepreneur is someone who jumps off a cliff and builds a plane on the way down. That quote was by Reid Hoffman, the founder and builder of Netflix. So in terms of introductions, I just wanted to let the panel introduce themselves. So I guess we'll start with you, Michael.
Hi, I head up Standard Bank's trust company in Jersey. We work with families and businesses structuring assets and structuring estates.
Good afternoon, my name is Clayton Bonnet. I head up the client structuring business within investment banking, and that looks at how we optimize transactions across tax, accounting, regulatory.
And my name's Stella Mangavin. I'm based in the bank's London office. I work in the wealth team. And so my purpose really is to work with families, business owners, to really walk the journey with clients in terms of structuring and managing their wealth.
Good. So I guess I wanted to kick this off with a little bit of audience participation. You guys are kind of in the dim light, so I can't see who's asleep and who's not. But we did get the after lunch slot. But just a quick show of hands, and how many people in this audience have sorted out wills, family constitutions, trusts, onshore structures, offshore structures, in a way that makes you feel really confident about legacy and succession. So can I get a show of hands of people who feel confident that they've sorted that out? Great work on the lights, whoever that was. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. I mean, that's kind of slightly worse than the global average, much worse actually. But I mean, it's quite interesting. We're sitting with probably never in a time in history is there going to be such an intergenerational transfer of wealth over the next 20 years. And what's interesting is 1 out of 2 kind of families and founders globally have a plan. 1 out of 4 have prepared the next generation for what's to come and succession. So those that haven't got it, rest assured we've got the best people, I think, in the country and on the continent to give you some perspective on it. But it's quite a telling stat that, you know, when we talk about legacy and legacies that last, I mean, you know, what is a legacy? Legacy is really, for me, about planting trees today, knowing full well that you will never personally enjoy that shade which you're building for the next generation. And the area is quite complicated, right? There's elements of business succession, which is a key kind of component. There's elements of wealth transfer. What are you transferring and to whom? There's elements of family governance. How do you regulate values, participation, marriage? How do you create something that's going to last for generations? And then finally, you know, it's a big word, we'll spend a bit of time on it, you know, family office design, what does that mean? So I guess to start, I mean, there's quite a sobering stat that on average, the 3rd generation in a family tends to lose all or most of the wealth. And it's quite a high proportion of families where that happens. And I guess maybe, Stella, my first question to you is, why do families not get it right? Why do they lose it by the 3rd generation? What are the things they do or don't do? What are the mistakes they make in your experience?
Yeah, thanks, Yusuf. How much time have we got, really? Families over the generations don't lose money typically because they've invested poorly. They lose money because the one thing that they typically fail to transfer is the skills and the values. And so a wealth creator, and many of you are that in this room, you know, your entrepreneurs, business owners, are so focused on building that business and on continuously creating. And in their minds somewhere, I believe that most people intend to get round to doing that thing. They intend to get round getting the structuring in place, tidying the wills up, speaking to the children, bringing in the spouse. And it's just a thing that never quite happens. And it's very emotive. So one of the things also that people struggle with is being completely honest about who they are, what their family's values are, and about who their children are. And getting into the weeds of, you know, who's capable of running the business, who wants to run the business, is it the kind of business that can survive over generations? And so what often happens is the 2nd generation, having seen the struggle, having seen the discipline and the grit and the determination, has some sort of grasp of what that means. And they often go through life with the sense of, well, let's just not mess up what mum and dad created. If we can just preserve and maintain, then that's not a bad thing. But by the time often you get to the 3rd generation and beyond, there's a disconnect that naturally sort of begins to happen. A disconnect between the discipline, the grit, the planning, and what it took to create that wealth. And people move from a sort of culture without really realizing it or meaning to, of creating, to a sort of an existence of consuming. So rather than producing, it's an existence of consuming. And as those generations marry and produce, you know, it just sort of widens out at the bottom. And you get sort of what I call lifestyle inflation. You know, the cost of sustaining all of that, all of the houses, the schools, the holidays, everything else, it's just more and more to sustain. And people fail to plan for how the, you know, the income, hopefully spinning off the capital pot, can cover that.
Thanks, Stella. I mean, the other thing that we know is certain in life, one is death, the other is taxes. I guess, Clayton, when you think about this, and especially as you think about, big business liquidity events, big wealth transfers, really big life-changing events for families or for founders, when you start thinking about tax and structuring and how to think about that, what are the big pitfalls that in your experience people miss or people don't take seriously enough?
I think the biggest thing is that wealth creators focused on creating the wealth. They don't actually think about what is the best way in which to structure this. How should I hold it? Do I hold it in my personal capacity? Do I hold it via a company? Do I hold it via a trust? Because a lot of the plumbing you put in place up front influences a liquidity event, the flexibility that you've got to exit in a more efficient manner, to transfer wealth. And also we find that often it's when the big liquidity event's coming that the wealth creator approaches an advisor and says, well, how do I do this in the right way? Can I get this into a trust? Can I externalize the wealth? And at that point, it's too late. So effectively, this is a perennial problem that we find with wealth creators. And the reality is that people need to start, irrespective of where they are on the journey. It's absolutely imperative that you start thinking very creatively around how do you hold things, because the longer you continue to build wealth in your personal capacity, the bigger the problem is going to be in terms of transferring it into a trust, which in many instances provides a number of benefits, including state duty savings and also the ability to effectively post your existence on this earth, talking about death. You can also, talking also to Stella's point around people effectively getting used to lifestyle inflation, etc. You can monitor through the trust deed effectively when people get distributions, how they get distributions, and also make sure that they have to be economically active. Because a lot of times people come into money and effectively say, well, I'm going to retire at 25, which is completely unsustainable.
Good. I mean, the one thing that's quite interesting about that principle is, and it's one of the families we work with and advise, which is, they have a principle that says you have to live your best life. So they're very, very judicious on capital. They're highly professionalized. So if you want to go to Oxford and study literature and become a professional poet, that's great. We'll give you education, we'll give you medical, we'll give you a home, we'll ensure your family is well sorted out. And that's fine, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can get more than you should. And so it's quite an interesting concept. And I think this family got it right because the founders started very early. The first generation started putting in place all of these mechanisms so people could be clear on what the combined family wealth was there for and not. So that's quite an important principle. I think the other thing that is a perennial debate on this, and it's very specific to emerging markets, but these days it's actually quite specific to developed markets. We engaged a German family who have quite a big business in Germany. We're buying a lot of real estate in the Western Cape across different areas. And the question was why? And the answer was, well, we got to diversify our wealth outside of Germany, because over the next 50 years, they had very firm views on where Europe and Germany was headed. So, Michael, the big debate which often arises is, what should we do? Should we look at something onshore, offshore? Is it worth thinking about setting up things offshore? And it'll be good to get your take on that. When do you start? When is it worthwhile? How should families or entrepreneurs think about the onshore-offshore debate?
Sure. Onshore, offshore is a simple question with a difficult answer behind it. And people often compare the two, but they're actually very different. And I think what you need to do when considering onshore, offshore is look at the family and look at the assets. And the reason I say that is if it's a family who is purely domestic, they have domestic assets, they have the beneficiaries are residents in SA, say, a domestic structure could work very well. Assuming, of course, your trustee is a proper trustee and your trustee is doing what a trustee should be doing, so making proper fiduciary decisions, they're independent, they're objective, they're doing proper governance, they understand the complex transactions they enter into, they properly document all of that, assuming all that. But the problem we have with our client base is they're rich. and rich people have lots of money, to state the obvious. And why that's a problem is the moment you're rich, you have the ability to move around the world. You have the ability to send your kids to be educated abroad. You may wish to go live in London for a while, or in Australia, or Dubai, or in Canada. You also want to diversify your asset class. So a bit like Yusuf, you mentioned their German family. Some wealthy families in Africa, they wish to buy assets abroad. Maybe it's property in the UK or the US. And that's where the offshore comes into it. Because where you have a complex family, so an African-centric family but with a global footprint, and an asset base which is global as well as domestic, that's where the offshore comes into play, because you have the professional trustees who are regulated, who do this as their job. As a matter of course, we will have numerous families with a similar fact base, which means we will know the planning for people living in the US, people living in Canada, the people living in the UK, the reporting you need to do, all those important things. I would say it's very difficult, if not almost impossible, to find a domestic trustee that can cope with the global family and the global asset base.
I mean, the one thing we also want to do on this panel is, entrepreneurs and business builders tend to be quite pragmatic, practical, operational. And, one of the things we thought would be very valuable is to start going through some very relatable stories, right? And each of these panelists are going to focus on, case studies, one where someone had got it right and it's amazing, and other cases where people have got it horribly wrong, and what it cost. And the one thing with legacy and wealth and transfer, which is its simplicity, but at the same time its complexity, is you have this confluence of emotion and family and value together with some very economic and rational decisions you need to make if you truly want to build a legacy that lasts. And so maybe, Stella, I could start with you. Just in your experience, in a very practical, obviously way, what are the situations where you think people have done it really well, entrepreneurs, founders, and families, and similarly where it's just gone horribly wrong?
Thanks,
Why?
Yusuf. Yeah. So in fact, the example I'd like to use is of two families who co-invested over a period of decades. So if I call them the founders, the first generation, a pair of wonderful old boys who in their early 20s began investing in the UK real estate market, built a very significant property portfolio over many years, and ran other businesses on the side. But if we just focus on that particular part of their portfolio, and each of them has children of their own. And more recently, for reasons that I won't go into, it was mutually agreed that the time had come for them to, in a very orderly manner, start to begin to separate their affairs, to allow each of their respective families an element of autonomy. And so the example of where it hasn't worked, or isn't working particularly well, is on the one side we have a family where there's the second generation, there are 3 children and then various grandchildren. And this particular patriarch, for reasons that I shall never quite understand, believed that it was never the right thing to do to be transparent with his wife and his children, and to never include them, to never have those open discussions about what there was and where it was. So I believe that for the 60 plus years that he and his wonderful wife have been together, she probably believed they were worth about 5% of what they were worth. And so got to the stage where he had to start thinking about who was going to take over the business. And as is the case, because life happens, the children were not aware of what there was. His son, who he, I believed, had hoped would take over, unfortunately has some substance abuse and mental health issues, so that really ruled him out. His youngest daughter, not interested, primary school teacher, and just not financially literate, wasn't, without being patronizing, it's just not her world. And so that left the eldest daughter, who had married someone who one might argue, is potentially financially ambitious. And so he became the person who sort of thrust himself forward and has, at the moment, is the one who's really running this particular portfolio and came in all gung-ho about how, I'm going to show you all how it's really done. The world has moved on. Big yawn, property so sleepy. We're going to go hell for leather and start investing in venture capital. Unfortunately, the trustees over here at the time pulled the handbrake and said, well, we might agree to allocating a certain percentage of the portfolio to that, but nothing like what you're talking. So here's a carve-out pot, and all the beneficiaries had to agree, etc. Anyway, so short story shorter, in a very short space of time, several tens of millions of dollars have disappeared into thin air because all of that, those VC investments have amounted to nothing. And the biggest mistake that patriarch made was that he was not transparent. He did not transfer his skill set to his children. And he did not want to have conversations that would cause conflict within the family. So very grudgingly handed over control to his son-in-law, but felt that there was no one else that he could hand over to. And rather than have some very clear parameters about how things would work, just almost surrendered control. So that's the one example, which is really quite disturbing to me. The other family, on the other hand, completely different example, where the patriarch, completely open with his wife and 2 children. The children fortunately get along, but I believe that's also a product of the upbringing. But one can't always control these things. I'm very aware of that. It was very clear from the time that his children were young that nothing was to be taken for granted, and that included their inheritance. Not to confuse love with inheritance. There are 2 very separate things. And as business people, one thing I would urge you to take away is to almost apply how you plan for your succession and your legacy as to how you plan in your businesses. You need to take the emotion out of it. And so his children were told that if they were interested in becoming involved in looking after the family assets and the family businesses, they needed to go abroad, they needed to go to university, they needed to achieve a minimum of this, and then they needed to go and find work and be employed in some sort of environment. In his case, he preferred a corporate environment because he wanted them to learn the governance for at least 5 years. And so that has happened with both children, both of whom are now involved in the business. And for example, his son is doing an internship within the own sort of family portfolio, going from business to business. And having visited them recently in their home country, the son does not even sit in the same building as his father, where the sort of, call it the family office is. He sits in one of the other subsidiary company offices doing the same job as everybody else. So I think that's a fantastic example of how that's going to survive.
Good. Clayton, good and the bad of what you've seen?
Well, the example I'll share has got a combination of good and bad, and it talks to the importance of obtaining proper advice and using a trustee that is experienced and is able to guide you on the journey. Because a lot of times entrepreneurs are good at what they do, but when we get into the world of setting up a trust, thinking about the future, creating the runway for the future, you need to be guided along the path. So the scenario that I'm going to relay now is effectively many, many years ago, a South African-based founder set up an offshore trust. The trust set up a Luxembourg company. The Luxembourg company acquired an interest in the South African business. Over many, many decades, this business expanded into America, the UK, and parts of Europe. And the trustees were mindful of the fact, the complexity, this onshore, offshore kind of aspect, and they entered into an arrangement with an international law firm, effectively, where there was a proactive mandate to monitor, based on the assumptions that had gone into the mix in setting the structure up, or if anything came along that could potentially compromise the founder, the trustees, or the beneficiaries, it was their responsibility to report back to the trustees. They were cited on a development that was happening in Luxembourg, which could potentially prevent a fiscally exempt exit should the family business be sold at some point in time. At that point in time, there was no intention to sell the business. The business was in a growth phase. However, steps were taken and combination of factors that happened. Effectively, the company was migrated across to another European jurisdiction. Fast forward 5 years forward, the business was sold, and they were able to exit and realize more than $500 million of tax-exempt earnings that came from that. So that was as a result of the trustees being sophisticated, being mindful, and effectively looking after the interests of the beneficiaries. However, as part of this process, it then became apparent that many of the beneficiaries were no longer residents in South Africa and effectively were now domiciled in the US, which meant that unless the trustees took significant steps in terms of restructuring the way that they ran the trust and made distributions to these beneficiaries, there was an effective state and federal tax of 65%. So you saved all the tax at the bottom, but you then failed to think about at the top. So the key message here is communication throughout the cycle, setting the trust up as well as you're going along, and then having professional trustees that can effectively hold your hand and be a second set of eyes.
Michael, on your
Yeah, I'll just add on to what you were talking about there. One of the biggest problems we have as a trustee, and we sit down with the families and say, before you do anything, please let us know. And people say, okay, and then you find out after something's happened, and by then the horse is bolted. And the example here, which I'm about to give of something which has gone wrong, is a gentleman came to see me in I think it was 2016, and he wanted to buy a property in London for, I think it was £8.5 million near Notting Hill. And I said, of course we can help you, but what we want to do beforehand is get some tax advice. So I took him to the tax advisor. The tax advisor said, give me your background. He said, I've moved to London, I've become tax resident, I've been renting, now I want to buy. I've just received a dividend offshore of 40 million euros. And the tax advisor said, why didn't you come and see me before you arrived in London? And he said, why? He said, because now you've received income offshore, that's taxable at 45%, which is about 300 plus million rand, in theory. Whereas if you'd come to see me before, received a dividend, then become resident, it would have been tax-free, because it was a capital remittance. And so the point here is, take the advice before becoming resident or before doing something, so you can plan properly. Something which has gone well is a family I worked with, which was an East African family. It was two sisters. Their mother settled a trust for them. The two sisters lived in London and in New York. The trust held two investment portfolios worth around $125 million each, so quite large. It also held an 18% interest in a very, very large London-based hedge fund. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is neither sister wanted to be involved in the management of the assets. One sister, who's US-based, wanted to be involved in the underlying fund, and so she was on the board of that. But both of them had charitable intentions. And so we set up a charity which was to benefit women, children, and education in East Africa. And they were very, very involved with that. They had no wish to be involved with the management of the assets, which we were left to do as a trustee. One sister was involved in the underlying hedge fund, which was paying dividends every year. But on the charitable side, they were very, very active and involved the whole family through different committees. What's also interesting about this family is they sat down and had the conversation and said, we want this wealth to be used for future generations. We want it to remain untainted in the sense that only the bloodline can benefit from the trust. So spouses were excluded, and it was even written into the trust deed that if a beneficiary was to get married, they would have to sign a prenup, or they could not remain a beneficiary. And I've seen that work. That's an example of something working very well.
Yeah, I mean,
Can I just add to that on this prenup issue? It's a wonderful thing to be able to have advisors like ourselves be the bad guy. So in the example that I gave earlier that's not worked so well, one of the things that we did as part of the restructure was say to the family that if this individual was going to take over control over, looking after this this family's assets, that they had to sign a postnup, which took almost a year to negotiate, just to give you an idea of how tricky these things can become. But it's really important that you do that. And the only other thing to add to this sort of part of the conversation is, if you do nothing else after you leave this forum this week, is if you don't have one, please go and put a will in place. And if you have assets in multiple jurisdictions, I implore you to please make sure that all of those assets are considered. And you can either have different wills in different jurisdictions, but they need to not contradict each other, or you have a will covering your worldwide assets. And so, for example, if people have assets in Europe and they draft a will in, we had an example recently in Switzerland, where someone sadly passed away and had a will and thought everything was fairly well organized, it was fairly straightforward, there were no children, there was just a long-term partner. And actually was blissfully unaware that Switzerland, like many other countries in Europe, has forced heirship, whereby the bloodline are automatically entitled to an equal share of one's estate. So if there's a spouse and 2 children, each of them is entitled to a third, regardless of whether or not there's a will. So these are all the sorts of things, to Clayton's point. Please, 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 seek the best advice that your money can buy.
I mean, the one thing which I think is interesting in working with a lot of families and entrepreneurs, you realize the wealth transfer requires, sometimes the founding entrepreneur can do it, a very different level of skill. Building a business, growing a business, driving a business is quite different from being a portfolio manager, allocating wealth, thinking about long-term dynamics. And I think there's a few thoughts on that. I think the first principle is you should see a family office, and a family office can be as large as offices in London, New York, Luxembourg, Tokyo, and China, or as small as, 2 professional trustees that help you think about the world, in relation to the wealth you're creating. And generally, it's quite specific to families, and there's a few drivers: the wealth level, the complexity of the underlying asset, geography, and most importantly, family dynamics. And I think the one thing we're seeing more and more is the most dangerous thing, I think, for a founder, patriarch, is the inability to engage on the reality of what they're seeing. I mean, I was in a conversation the other day. There's 3 sons, phenomenally wealthy, Pan-African family. The first son, sadly, is not good at anything in the way that his father was. So he can work at a subsidiary, he can run it, but ran it horribly. Guarantees were issued. One part of the business had to bail out the other part. And you're sitting with the third son who's saying, my father's unable to have the conversation with the other 2 brothers to say, listen, the future has to be not the eldest, simply because you're not good, the third. And it's a worry that they've had for years and years, and we starting to get a bit involved in terms of how we help them with that. So I think the one thing really that's quite important to focus on is, because it all sounds quite overwhelming and there's lots of complexity, but maybe I'll start with Stella. Like where do you start? What's the cheapest mistake to avoid? What is it that people can actually just start doing so that you can kick off this process?
So simply put, Joseph, I think I sort of covered a lot of it already. I would say just start by being alone with your own thoughts and being honest with oneself about who you are, about what your values are, and about, if you think about your family in 10, 20, 50 years, what is it that you want that to look like? And also be realistic, as I mentioned earlier, about who your children are, about who your grandchildren are. And, being capable of taking over a business is one thing. Being interested in taking over a business is something entirely different. And I often feel that it is an unenviable position for an individual to be born into any degree of wealth, because then one feels an obligation, certainly in family-run businesses, to continue that. And the next gen office suffer from a fear of, well, how do I live up to that person or that person? How do I compare? How do I compete? There's all of this sort of imposter syndrome stuff. So being completely transparent with one's family, talking, being open, teaching, transferring the skills, listening to what they have to say, and to the extent that you can, thrashing out those difficulties amongst yourselves as a family. And once you are clear on that, your value and your purpose as a family, then you can start to talk about how the sort of, the money, the business is then structured and handed over. And then you move on to sort of bringing in the advisors.
I guess, Clayton, moving on to you, let's assume you've figured out what you want or don't want as a founder, as a family, etc. What then is the next key step to start?
I think because it's personal, you need to find an advisor that you can relate to and trust. The fact that someone is the best in the market doesn't necessarily mean that it resonates and you actually value their advice. Because the relationship that you're going to build with this advisor or this firm is going to be for the next 20, 25 years, and hopefully when you're no longer around, the next generation will be able to communicate, and the legacy, they've got this institutional knowledge that goes along with why the structure looks the way it is. So it's one, identifying a reputable advisor that you relate to and you intrinsically trust, and they behave as if it's their own money. The second thing is you've got to be honest. You've got to tell the advisor the whole story, and I think it talks to Stella's point where the entrepreneur knows where, to use the phrase, where the bodies are buried. And they don't necessarily want to say, I've got this here, I've got that here, I've got this here, because questions might be asked, well, where did that wealth originate from? All those uncomfortable questions. But if you want to put in place a structure or effectively regularize everything, you need to be completely transparent, and the advice that you need to get needs to talk to the facts. And the final thing that I would say is, entrepreneurs build businesses and they are conscious of money and are they getting value for it? And often this advice is seen as a grudge purchase. But I honestly believe that it should be seen as an investment, because if you get it right, you're getting it right for the next 1, 2, 3 generations, and hopefully the fourth if it's not lost by then. But these are the sort of factors that I think are absolutely critical around that.
Michael, on your side, probably.
Clayton, I agree. The advice is very important, because what we do as a trustee is we then take it and we implement it and we run with the structure. Now, what I'd say is, just because your friend has one structure doesn't mean you need to have the same structure. Every single family is different in terms of how their dynamic is, where their assets are, where their residency is, what they want to do with the assets, how they want to spend it, how they will spend it. I was telling these guys a joke earlier, and this is the child you don't want. Anyone here remember George Best? He used to play for Man United, one of the world's best football teams, of course. And, well, third place, but next year we'll be champions. That wasn't a joke. And George Best said, he was asked towards the end of his life, how did you spend your money? And he said, I spent it on women, fast cars, and alcohol, and the rest I wasted. And that is not the kid you want. So when you're setting up the structure, you need to be very aware of how your kids will spend the money, or how they'll try and spend the money. And what you also need to remember is what you put in place now, and what Stella touched upon there, will look different in 50 years because your family will evolve. And what you need is to have the capacity within your structure for it to evolve with the family. Otherwise, it's just going to be an anchor holding them back. So basically, engage, do the soul searching, get the advice, engage a good trustee, and let them put in place a structure which is fit for purpose. And unfortunately, that will also cost money.
No, I mean, I think the one point, other than Stella's point on a will, and I am often surprised. I mean, entrepreneurs who have multi-billion-dollar businesses, and when you start going through the questions, and being an entrepreneur, I think it's a different obsession. You're building, you're growing, you have to solve everything, right, in a really difficult way. And I don't want to disparage the medical fraternity, but I have a lot of friends that are surgeons, and I'd say to them, well, you arrive at the hospital, if the nurses are on strike, you go home. You can't do that in a business. You have to deal the unions, deal the employees, deal the staff. The crane didn't arrive. Well, it has to arrive because it's your business and it grows. And that takes a lot of time and commitment. But I think in thinking about legacy, thinking about wealth transfer, succession, you almost got to approach it with the right support with the same energy and focus and deliberation that you've applied in building the business. And I guess the two things I guess I'd leave everyone with, if there's something to remember. One, all of the research globally, and that's just how this works, have suggested that the most successful kind of legacies that are built on the basis that it is a process. It may take a few years, it may take time to get everything right, to get everything in place. So it's not an event, it's not the business is now yours, move on. And that process has complexity on business succession, preparing the next generation, understanding what they really want, structures you need to put in place, management of the wealth that's created continuously from the business. So that's the first thing. It's a process and not an event. And then the second thing is you just have to start early. You could deal with someone who started a business and 10 years ago it was worth 100 million rand and they didn't do what they needed to do on the ownership and the holding structure. And today it's worth like 10 billion. And that's what entrepreneurs do. They build great and powerful businesses. And suddenly, your 100 million rand problem is now a 10 billion rand problem. So just keep that in mind. It's a process, not an event. There's lots of valuable people in the bank, out the bank, in the market that can help you. And please, just start now. It's the right thing to do. And it's important, for the people that are going to be sitting in the shade of the tree that you're planting today.
Actually, Yusuf, could I just add, you're talking about going from 100 million down to 10 million, which is obviously not what we want to do. But the point there is entrepreneurs are risk takers. You jump off the cliff, you build your plane on the way down. What often we see happen when people engage with the advisors and when they set up the structures is a segregation of personal wealth and business wealth. Because what we find often is the business is an extension of the entrepreneur. And so a lot of the risks they take in their business life, they're taking with assets which are strictly really personal assets. The business is too cash rich, it should be taken out as a dividend. There's assets which are held through the business which should be held personally. So what you often end up with is, depending on the size of the family's assets, is almost a personal structure and a business structure, and one feeds the other. But what that also does is we also deal with sometimes entrepreneurs who have this big liquidity event. Now, just because you've had your big liquidity event doesn't mean you suddenly stop being an entrepreneur. So what we say to those guys is just take some risk off the table. Take your billion rand, maybe, sell proceeds. I mean, if that's the case, well done. Put maybe 100 million into a trust. It's there as a nest egg, it's nice and safe. Then go and take the risk with the other 900 million and maybe turn it into 2 billion. But it's about taking the risk off the table and having that nest egg and segregating the assets as well.
Cool. So listen, thanks everyone for the time. It's a great panel. I see we have 10 minutes and 20 seconds for questions. So pretty happy to take any questions from the audience. Gentleman in the second row.
Hi, David Pilling, Financial Times. Sadly, I'm a journalist, so I don't have these problems to worry about. But but I do have a question. I found it a fascinating panel, actually. Which is, does there ever come a point when your advice is you need to let go? You've taken your business only so far, and now you need either professional management, or you need to think about listing the company or selling parts of it. And I say this for two reasons. I mean, one, it might be the rational thing to do for the individual. And two, going back to the opening panel, I mean, you need more public companies on the continent, so that they can grow, so that others can participate. I mean, that's not your job specifically. You're there to advise the individual. But just in general, is your advice sometimes it's time to let go?
Yeah, I think it depends on the business, and we had a very fresh idea of a fintech that started in Nigeria with a very talented entrepreneur, And as it grew, I mean, he's a serial entrepreneur, he had lots of other things. We went through a process of him letting go. So private equity capital came in, so you had to give up a little bit of control. And eventually we listed that business on the JSE last year. And so I think it's generally dependent on the family and what they want. So you get some entrepreneurs that would say, I'd like to build a business and list it, and they understand in that evolution, they let it go. You get other entrepreneurs who have great intergenerational transfer. And to quote what one entrepreneur said, you know, I'm going to build all these businesses and every one of them is going to be a dividend factory. And so literally I'm going to just create this. And fortunately, he's got the intergenerational transfer and succession for the next generation to take it. So I think it depends. The last point I'll make on that, and I'm sure the panel have views, generally good entrepreneurs have built great businesses by controlling outcomes to the nth degree. I mean, they are really on top of it. They'll tell you this truck's going to be 9 minutes late. And you're like, oh, wow, you got a lot of trucks, but you know that. So generally, it's a bit of a personal process, an evolutionary process with them. Sometimes you have to say to an entrepreneur, the way you built, you shouldn't hold 30% of this because you're going to struggle to be a non-executive chairman, etc. And you go through that. And I think it's part of the journey. Others are very good. You know, they're comfortable to let go. I mean, there's great businesses where, you know, they've been built and institutionalized and, you know, entrepreneurs are still collecting huge dividends of their stakes in it. So personality, maturity, horses for courses, but that's definitely, you know, one of the bits of perspective and advice we give.
Yeah.
I'd say whilst the matriarch or patriarch or first generation is still alive, it's an easier discussion. And sometimes you can have what's called in a trust an emotive asset. So it stirs emotion. And if you have someone settle a trust and they put the family business into it and they put an investment portfolio into it at the same time, and if you say, we want to sell this business, you'll get a much stronger reaction than actually we'd like to change investment manager. So it depends on the asset. We've had instances where as trustee we've had to stop because we were being asked to take money from the portfolio, inject it as capital into the business. And the answer there is, at some point you have to draw a line and say, this doesn't make commercial viable sense. Now, at the same time, as a trustee, you don't really like making a big decision like, let's sell the family business which has been held for 3 generations. So what you would tend to do is try and have some sort of clause in your trustee which sort of delegates that responsibility. It's like an investment committee or someone with some sort of reserve power, but that's just a complexity. So basically, what I'm trying to say is there's an evolution over time, but when you get beyond the first generation, if it's an emotive asset, the decision you make around that asset can sometimes be quite difficult because maybe half the beneficiaries say we need to sell, we don't have anything to do with a factory which is making something which is not ecologically friendly, and the other half want ESG-only investments. And you sort of get that conflict as well.
I mean, other questions?
This one over there.
Is it unusual, is it unusual? Hello. Is it unusual to have a family that's got a business trust and that's got a family trust? First question, is it unusual? And second one, is it strategic? Because I've seen people do that.
Clayton, do you want to take that?
No, I don't think it's unusual. It talks a bit to what Michael's talking about. What is the family wealth? What is the business wealth? And effectively building a firebreak around both of them. Still, it seems like you're nodding in agreement.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's something that we would often encourage. I think Michael actually said so earlier, and you know every case is different because these things do come at a cost, and we're very conscious of that. So we would always look at the most efficient and effective way to structure a family's personal and business assets, keeping costs in mind. But yes, often it can be very neat to keep them separate, or you know, one can set up more complex structures, which we won't go into now, where the business assets can be settled into a trust that also includes the personal assets. But the thing that's really important with all of these is, you know, who are the directors of those companies, who are the trustees of those trusts, and very different rules apply, for example, in South Africa to what would apply in Jersey. So in South Africa, which is just an anathema to me, is that one can be a trustee of one's own trust. There is no such concept in a place like Jersey. And so, crucially, who are those people that are your trustees? So in Standard Bank's case, there is no one individual trustee. It's a corporate trustee representing the Standard Bank Group, corporate directors representing the Standard Bank Group. So if, for example, Michael decides that he wants to retire one day, the structures aren't all going to come to a grinding halt. There's an entire team that continues. The corporate trustee continues. So again, I don't know how familiar people are with the concept of a protector, but very often you've got the settlor of a structure who's of a certain age or getting to a certain age, and they appoint a protector who typically is a peer, and so not getting any younger either. And so you're sort of putting the structure in place where you're closer to your death than you were a few years ago, and that the person that you're sort of putting there to oversee things in the event of your demise may well go before you. So these are all the sorts of things that we look at.
I mean, the one principle is, the one principle is, if you think about it, and as a portfolio matter, I'll be simplistic. Most families have a stay-rich portfolio and a get-rich portfolio, right? Stay-rich tends to be usually the business. They know it well, they understand it. It'll continue to generate cash flow and tends to be, even when they move out of the business into other things, it's very conservative, it's bonds, it's stocks, it's blue chip. Then there's an allocation on get rich, which is venture capital, early stage stuff, new ventures. And generally, if you look at all the theory and all the global best practice, the separation between the business side and the family side is quite important. I think as families grow, the diversification then is quite important in terms of that. So for example, we deal with a very big family with huge business in West Africa, and their kind of get-rich portfolio is an operational business. It's huge. They go into new things like every 3 months. They take a lot of very calculated risk, and they've done very well out of it. In the family office, it is the most boring portfolio you've ever seen, and they're like, listen, we're taking all the risk in the business. That's what we understand. We'll go into new and interesting things. When it comes to the family office, it's treasuries, bonds, Microsoft shares, that's it. So the separation is critical. And I think these days, if you think about it, risk management is becoming more important for families. I'm sure there's lots of families who thought it was great to have many millions of dollars in a real estate in Dubai. I think you've got a lot of that now kind of being re-looked at and thought about as the world changes. So I'd say the separation is quite important. And definitely the bigger, most institutional families are quite clinical about ensuring that separation between business flows, business risk, and the family risk.
Just to add, I'm conscious of time, is that what you might find as well is the governance structure is different between each trust. So in the business trust, you might have a certain governance structure where certain people can benefit different if they're working in the business as opposed to those who are not. There might be people involved in committees which can make decisions in relation to the underlying business, whereas it might be completely different in the personal assets as well. So that might be another reason.
I think that, I'll take one question. Yeah, I'll go for it, last one.
Yeah. My question is to do with first-time entrepreneurs or first-generation entrepreneurs. Do you have guidance in terms of existing mentorship programs for families that such entrepreneurs in Africa? Obviously, I would expect that if I am from Malawi, I would be inclined to associate or learn from a family in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in Botswana, in Zambia, and Namibia, or even up north. But also different families are coming from either ethnic groups or church denominations. Do you have advice or a group or a list that one would look into?
Yeah, so I'll answer the question in two ways, and then Stella can tell us if there's anything. So generally, the family relationships, including people that they go to for perspectives, are deeply relational, right? So what's interesting, I've found in a lot of markets, your first-time entrepreneurs definitely formally, informally, tend to have other people they trust, right? Tends to be older entrepreneurs, tend to be families that have been around longer and been in that business. So the first advice I'd give is just figuring out in your own market who are the right people in the networks where you can build something relational will give you perspective on it. Because usually families don't like to share with families they don't have a deep relationship with. They just don't. So I would say I've seen good examples of that. So I've seen, for example, a very smart pharmaceutical entrepreneur who probably took one of the best pharmaceutical guys in the country who's 20 years older than him and made him the chairman of his family council. So, they've done things like that. So he's got the benefit of that experience. I'd say that's the first one. The second one, I guess it depends on the relationship with the bank. I mean, obviously, we sit in a unique vantage point, and Stella can chat a bit more, but we have a lot of advisory and perspective on those things. And Stella, maybe you can chat through. So one, I'd say in your market or cross markets, people you do business with, bigger families, more, you should build those networks and relationships because there's a lot you'd get out of that. I mean, and then obviously there's a big piece we can help with.
Yeah, so Yusuf's absolutely right. I would say that if you have an existing relationship with Standard Bank, for example, we have a huge amount of experience and we see all sorts of versions of how this plays out with sort of founders right through to sort of 6th, 7th generation. And what we typically tend to do is, we spend a lot of time really just listening to what clients have to say, just trying to get to know who they are and understanding, just trying to really hear what they're saying. What are the words, but what's the actual meaning of what they're saying? And then where appropriate, and exercising all due discretion, we take that very seriously, is connecting clients with other like-minded families or people that we think they can learn from. So we have, for example, we're hosting an event in London on Monday, which is, for sort of 20 clients where we bring together a group of people and we have a sort of a thought leadership sort of discussion. We invite a guest speaker in, and that serves as a networking event. And we're very careful about who we invite to these things. It's, trying to bring people together where we think either there are co-investment opportunities, they can learn from each other. And so also, as Yusuf says, within your own market and in your own circle, the only thing I would say, caution against that, is no one size fits all. And so what may be appropriate for ABC family is not necessarily appropriate for XYZ family. And all too often, we see people saying, I've got a friend who did this. At one stage, all the South Africans were tripping over themselves to get a Portuguese investor visa, for example. These things come with all sorts of traps. So yes, listen to what people are saying, but then go to a credible advisor to fact check. Leave it at that.
Good. I think we're out of time. Thanks, everyone. You've been a great audience, quite interactive, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well done. Thank you. Am I coming on Monday to London? Thank you, Yusuf. I think the only question I had as they were leaving the panel to Stella was whether I'm coming on Monday too. All right, our next address is going to be on the topic of trust infrastructure. It's going to be delivered by an expert who is a leading and internationally recognized expert on it's a bit odd because he's already on stage, on global history and contemporary politics. Without any further ado, as I